guess we're supposed to start on time and we're already 5 minutes late. So welcome. It's if you want to come up to the front, we can have a very intimate conversation, or else stay where you are. The title of the talk is, or the title of this session is very, well, there are many ways that we could interpret it. So I'm sure the various members of the panel are going to see it through different eyes. I'd just like to make a couple of comments before I go over to the experts here. And that is that I think the most powerful message we get from environmentalism is that we all live in the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. And in the biosphere, everything is connected to everything else. Nothing is a way out there separate and isolated. And I think for me, that message came through loud and clear when the environmental movement began with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962. As she pointed out, you spray chemicals to kill bugs on your crops and end up affecting fish and birds and human beings. And of course, we got a graphic example of, I don't think I need this. We got a graphic example of how interconnected things are. When Chernobyl happened, the first people to announce that something had happened at Chernobyl were Swedish scientists who detected a spike of radioactivity over Sweden, because of course air doesn't stay within national boundaries. And there's nothing that illustrates the interconnectivity more than the problem we face right now with climate change. I mean, at its base, it's the excessive. Oh, you guys need the mic. Yes. So at the base, it's the excessive generation of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels that now overwhelms the biosphere's capacity to reabsorb it. So we get a change in the chemistry of the atmosphere that ultimately is trapping more heat on the surface of the planet. But the interconnectedness is illustrated by the fact that at the interface between the atmosphere and the oceans, you get the dissolving of carbon dioxide into the oceans as carbonic acid, and so we're getting an acidification of the oceans with consequences we have no idea in the long run what this is going to be. And then on land, of course, we get huge changes as well. And I live in a province in Canada, British Columbia, where forestry is one of our primary industries. And in our forests, we have a naturally occurring parasite on our pine trees called the mountain pine beetle. And they have existed in this ecosystem for 10,000 years. And the pine beetle has been kept under control by winter temperatures and summer humidity. And as long as we get winters in which we have 5 consecutive days of 40 degrees below zero, the mountain pine beetle is contained. We haven't had that in northern British Columbia now for a number of years. And the consequence is when you fly over northern British Columbia, the forest has turned from green to bright red because we've lost $65 billion of pine trees that have now just been devastated by the mountain pine beetle, which is an insect smaller than a grain of rice. And this has been catastrophic. So just the fact of the increased levels of carbon dioxide have enormous repercussions, not only in the atmosphere, but in the oceans and on the land. And I think one of the major problems we face today is that sense of fragmentation of the world around us, so that we no longer see the interconnectivity. Now, I know it says interdependence, but I think interconnectivity, interdependence are pretty well related. I find that in our major newspapers, in a single issue, you can read a report about a flood in Bangladesh, a drought in Ethiopia, melting polar ice caps in the Arctic, and they're all reported on separate pages, and there's no indication that maybe there's a commonality that runs through them all. And so the way that we report shatters the world, and we no longer see that exquisite interconnectivity. And to me, the illustration of the way that our world has been shattered came through very loud when I decided to do a show on asthma a few years ago. Canada has catastrophic rates of asthma among children. Over 15% of children are now developing asthma. And I said, we've got to do a major program on this, and one of the first things we'll do is go down to the hospital to on a smog alert day, and we went down to the emergency ward in Toronto when there was a smog alert, and it was filled with old people and children who were having severe asthma attacks. And what struck me was I would watch these parents bringing in their children. You could see their eyes were bugged out. They were terrified. They couldn't get their child to the doctor in time. And they would do anything to save their children from these terrible episodes. But many of them drove up in a sports utility vehicle. And to me, that was just an illustration of the way that we no longer see our interconnectedness and the way that we are a part of the problem that we're trying to deal with. So that's just a few words I'd like to say. Now we have, unfortunately, Vandana Shiva hasn't arrived, but I'm sure these three men will take up the slack. And let's start then with Sean Cleary, who's the Managing Director of Strategic Concepts in South Africa. Just a few words.
Thanks very much, David. I'm not sure that three men are going to be able to compensate for Vanita's absence, but in any event, we'll sort of see what we can do with what we've got. As I'm going to talk first, I'm going to say something a little bit different to what I'd originally planned to say. So let's just pick up on what you've said, because I think it's perhaps the most interesting point. When we're being asked to think about taking interdependence seriously in the context of climate change, what are we being asked to do? And it seems to me the only way that you can answer that question is if you think about what is meant by interdependence, because we actually have to link two concepts here. The one you've spoken to admirably. It's perfectly clear that viewed from the perspective of the biosphere, or if one wanted to take it to its outer limits, James Lovelock's Gaia, the level of interconnectedness, the level of systemic interconnectivity is absolutely extensive. It is almost impossible to think about the phenomenon of climate change in the absence of recognition that you are dealing with highly adaptive, complex systems that behave in non-linear fashions. So we can't predict it with any degree of specificity. It is an immensely complex, highly interconnected system, and therefore, almost by definition, no human on the planet can think of him or herself as being unrelated to anyone else in that particular context. So that's one way in which interdependence plays out in this particular regard. It's the contextual interdependence of us all within the parameters of the biosphere itself. That is probably fairly close to the way that we think about interdependence when we talk about it in economic terms, because the classic definition of interdependence in economic terms is a system where part of the failure in the event of the system malfunctioning at any particular point on time is passed on to all participants in the system. So the financial crisis of the last few years is a classic illustration of extraordinary interconnectedness, to take David's phrase, and reciprocal interdependence among a variety of institutions which had invested in each other's instruments. So the system behaved in that way. This is quintessential when one is thinking about climate, and one has to bring that particular dimension to bear. But there's another way to think about interdependence, and this is the dimension that we probably have to think about when we're trying to investigate policy. Because if we're being asked to take interdependence seriously in the context of climate, presumably we have to translate the objective reality of interdependence back into some behaviors which would reflect that interdependence in ways that would advance the common good. Otherwise, we're not taking it seriously, it seems to me. So in that second sense, interdependence is curiously defined as a dynamic condition of being mutually and physically responsible to and sharing a common set of principles with